Okay, hello everyone, welcome back. We are going to get started. Our presenters today have a set of amazing papers for us to enjoy, and so without further ado, we will begin with Dr. Álvarez Velasco. Dr. Álvarez Velasco is an assistant professor at UIC. Her research analyzes the interrelationship between mobility, control, and spatial transformations across the Americas. She is the author of the book Frontera Sur Chiapaneca, El Muro Humano de la Violencia. She founded and co-coordinated the Transnational Digital Project in Mobilities in the Americas and COVID-19, and she is a member of Colectiva Infancia, an international research network specialized in children migration across the Americas. Please give her a warm welcome.
How do we get the presentation? Yeah. Okay, good morning, everyone. The tension between human migrations and the border regimes that impede or propel those mobilities is one of the most complex conflicts of our time. Fueled by economic misery and growing violence, an increased number of irregularized transit migrants have reached the Mexico-US border in the post-pandemic era. By October 2021, 1.7 million migrants from 160 countries were encountered at this border. By October 2022, that figure doubled. Some were transcontinental migrants coming from India, Bangladesh, or Cameroon, while others were intra-regional migrants from Cuba, Haiti, Brazil, Ecuador, or Venezuela. They have joined those traditionally coming from Mexico and Central America, who together press against one of the most lethal borders worldwide in their relentless effort to enter the US. Those migrants, diverse in ages, genders, race, ethnicity, and class, do not arrive overnight, let alone safely or directly. On the contrary, they accumulate experiences of violent and lawful transits across Latin American borders. Since they depart by air, land, and sea routes from their homelands, they might have been transiting for days, weeks, or years. Some might have been dwelling in South America, where they sought for a safe haven which never arrived. That's why they decided to remigrate. Once they get underway, they move and wait. They get stuck and transit. The irregularized journeys are an ongoing spatial struggle that unfolds between a continuum of mobility, immobility, and immobilizations. Migration temporalities have become prominent within migration studies. Sharam Khosravi, William Walters, and many critical thinkers have called to overcome the mobility bias, overemphasizing mobile experiences, ignoring migrants' immobilities and immobilizations, and the enmeshed infrastructures. Immobilities might result from the autonomous decision of migrants to strategically stop en route, while immobilizations from the exercise of power to reduce migrants' in freedom of movement. This call arises within a global anti-racist, with a global racist anti-migrant turn, which has seen the state expand its capacity to detain and immobilize racialized migrant bodies or to externalize borders as hegemonic powers such as the US do, confining migrants to border entrapments and slow deaths. Immobilities and immobilizations do not only result from states' repressive apparatus. By focusing on the dynamics of the Andean region and Central America corridor and inspired by this call, today I will explain the politics of immobilities present in some private places and transit infrastructures. Bodegas, hotels, and Casas de Seguridad are private places located around border towns and land routes where migrants are temporarily held as part of the modus operandi of unlawful transits to the United States, dominated by coyotes, paracos, or paramilitaries, in collision with border agents. While being a means of transport, camiones, on the other hand, also hold migrants while crossing borders. Here, truck drivers operate colluded with border agents. This is an initial approach based on my multi-sided ethnographic work conducted across the Ecuador-Colombia border and on the reconstruction of Latin American, Caribbean, and African migrants' trajectories since 2016. I propose two interconnected arguments. First, that bodegas, casas de seguridad, hotels, and camiones, far from simply being containers of migrants waiting en route, are socially built sites of power, and in the case of camiones, mobile sites of power within heterogeneous strategies of migrations and border regimes. I also argue that waiting time or immobility is not a passive phase of migration, but utterly productive. Productive because it is when migrants strategize to sustain their mobilities, and productive because those sites are part of highly lucrative border economies where legal, illegal, licit, illicit economic practices gain value around the extraction of migrants' time. If those sites take part in controlling migrant mobility, it should be explained as an effect of the punitive turn in migration operating since last decade in the Andean region, as well as its accelerated impoverishment. That is why these sites, as I will show, are embedded in the political economy of the analyzed migratory corridor, having simultaneously repressive and productive effects. In what follows, I will explain the role that the Andean region plays in the geography of migration of the Americas. Then I share empirical evidence to illuminate my two arguments, to close with some final remarks on what the immobilization of transit migrants to private hands alerts us about our abject present. The immobilities and immobilizations that I study are inexplicable outside the changing migration and control patterns of the Andean region and, more broadly speaking, of South America. From being migrant-sending countries in the past 2 decades, most South American countries also became migration receptacles and global transit spaces. Systemic inequality, wartime conflicts, ecological devastation, and fortress US and Europe converged to explain the arrivals of African, Asian, and Caribbean migrants, mainly from Cuba, Haiti, and the DR to South America. If those mobilities had changed migratory patterns, the Venezuelan exodus of more than 7 million people would definitely disrupt it. In this changing pattern, South American migratory legal openness, between quotes, has been pivotal. Most South American legal frameworks claim to guarantee, amongst other rights, the freedom of movement and the right to asylum. This explains why, in the past decade, global migrants reach South America to seek asylum, to try their luck, or to transit from there to the US. As these migrations augmented, a regional transit and selective punitive turn unfolded, materialized in restrictive immigration policies, blockages to asylum, deportations, and the reimposition of visas to global South countries, measures also intended to curb down arrivals of impoverished and wanted migrants and asylum seekers to the US. Unlike what has happened between the US and Mexico, which together maintain the most extensive migrant detention system worldwide, until now, in the Andean region, there are no formal migrant detention systems. Yet, this does not mean that other private places operate in the temporary immobilization of migrants, as I will now explain. Irregularized Caribbean, African, and Asian migrants can cross the Ecuador-Colombia border by paying camiones. For the past decade, For the past 30 years, Darío, a truck driver, runs up his salary crossing people. Depending on the Colombian destination, this takes him from 2 to 10 hours. If he gets stopped, he uses codes. He says, I tell Colombian cops that I have tornillitos. This is how they know that I carry migrants. Then I pay them $50 to pass. Darío has crossed Asians, Bangladeshi, Chinese, Cubans, and Africans, charging them $30. He only carries small groups, instructing them to be quiet and to move as little as possible. Migrant recounts confirm that while immobile in Camiones, they often pray, they do not speak, and when they do so, it is to get information about the journey. If there is a shared aim between transit migrants, it is to reach Necoclí or Turbo, two highly crowded Colombian border towns, the last ones before crossing the Caribbean Sea, to later enter the dangerous Darien jungle en route to the US via Panama. To advance in this convulsive route, paradoxically, they must wait, and they do so in modest border hotels. Self-guided migrants transiting in groups or with families stop for days in hotels. This happens when they wait to get wire transfers or raise money. In Ecuador, for example, migrants stop to work in the hyper-precarious, informalized, but dollarized economy. Hotels become thus migrants' temporary houses where they rest, take care, share food, charge phones, activate transnational communications, and download information which is pivotal for their route. Amadora, a Venezuelan migrant, asserted that to afford hotels' price, migrants make cooperachas, a collective payment, negotiate and pay the hotel manager to get a reasonable price. Coyotes also pay hotel managers not to denounce what they are temporarily immobilizing migrants in hotel rooms while retaining their passports. This is how migrant smuggling is experienced by African, Caribbean, or Asian migrants who pay up $1,000 to be crossed from Ecuador to Necoclí. Bodegas also hold migrants. According to residents in the Amazonian border, these rented warehouses are managed by enganchadores, or middlemen, working with coyotes to identify potential clients within migrants. There, contraband of gas, home appliances, or drugs are also kept. This is why bodegas are fearful waiting places for migrants. Casas de Seguridad, lastly, is an euphemism to name private houses where migrants are immobilized by coyotes for days until new payments are made and transits are resumed. The Mexico-US corridor, as you know, is swamped by Casas de Seguridad. In the Andean region, Central America corridor, so far, the most recurrently identified Casa de Seguridad is a private infrastructure at the foot of the Darien jungle, La Finca de Arcandí, where hundreds of global migrants are kept. The account of Dennis, a 24-year-old Ecuadorian migrant, is revealing. We were taken to this finca after crossing the sea. Guides put a handle around our wrists and a payment sign. I met migrants from India, Peru, Africa, Venezuela, and Ecuador. We spent 2 nights before entering the Darien. Denis' descriptions portrayed a sort of Tower of Babel within lush nature. Global migrants waited while organizing routes, grouping, and negotiating with guides. Complex logistics coordinated by guides also unfolded to provide food, plastic tents, and information. Denis described how a job market unfolded while they waited. Charging between $10 to $50, Venezuelans who had crossed the Darien offer services including protection and guidance, being maleteros or luggage carriers, and even carriers of children when crossing the jungle. Denis paid $300. He waited with approximately 700 migrants. You can multiply it and get an idea of the $1 million amount of money that migrants in Mobilities produced. I asked Denis if while waiting there were signs of state authority. There are only paracos, he replied. Paracos are paramilitaries of the formerly Autodefensas Gaitanistas de Colombia, today part of the Clan del Golfo, the largest drug trafficking gang in the Andean region, an hegemonic armed actor interacting with migrant smuggling networks. This suggests that in this region, irregularized transit migration management, it's not only in private hands, but is part of criminalized governance, which, as our colleague Andreas Feldman studies, flourishes in spaces with low or null state presence, or where that presence is colluded with illegalized practices. To close, hotels, bodegas, casas de seguridad, and camiones share three features. First, they are sites founded on an exercise of power to repress migrants' mobilities. Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about the prison fixity to unveil how unfreedom is the extraction of the one non-renewable source, time, to produce value. Not being prisons, these sites are spatio-temporal fixities that also operate by extracting migrants' time to produce exchange value, entering into circulation as part of the political economy of the studied corridor. Second, the politics of immobilities in those places have therefore a repressive and productive effect. They repress mobility while producing value, not only economic value, but social value. Care, solidarity, knowledge to strategize, negotiate, and resist such complex journeys. Third, what happens inside those private sites remains an enigma. No one really knows how many migrants are extorted, physically and emotionally abused, have disappeared, or died. Those sites fall into a gray zone, which, as Agamben points out, is the characteristic of the state of exception, where confined to the right of having no rights, the migrant life survives only by grouping and caring for each other. And I finish with this. This is an initial analysis that signals that against irregularized transit migration, Andean states seem to have ceded the management of this type of migration to private hands, subsumed in criminalized governance. By not intervening to protect migrants' lives, not to create decent jobs, those states ultimately confine migrants and asylum seekers from impoverished Latin American, Caribbean, Asian, and African countries to slow and premature deaths. In this present time of intensifying systemic contradictions, the migrant struggle is added to that of many other social movements across the Americas, which are claiming for a radical transformation against the accelerated destruction of life. Decisively accompanying and making visible that struggle should be part of our critical and committed research. Migrants won't stop to move and wait as part of a special struggle to be alive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Álvarez Velasco. Our next presenter is Dr. William Walters. Dr. Walters is a professor of political sociology at Carleton University, Ottawa, Canada. His main research interests are secrecy and security, borders and migration, and mobility in politics. Recent publications include State Secrecy and Security, Reconfiguring the Covert Imaginary, Biopolitics, Borders, Migration, and the Power of Locomotion, and the forthcoming Handbook on Governmentality. From 2017 to 2022, he directed the Air Deportation Project, a multi-country inquiry into the aerial geographies of forced removal and expulsion in and from Europe. Please welcome him.
I'm just looking for my slides.
Can I help? I can help. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you very much to the organisers for this kind invitation. I've really enjoyed the presentation so far. It's great to be here. So there's a structure of what I'd like to talk about today. It's talks kind of based around a paper that's almost finished, and I'll send it off to the journal Mobilities. But I also expand a little bit for today by talking a bit more broadly about what I mean by air deportation. So I want to start with a vignette that I expand on in the paper, and it concerns a controversy that surrounded the UK's attempt to deport 50 men, all male, to Jamaica on a charter flight in December 2020. And there are several angles of this immigration controversy that could be followed. One that I talk about a little bit in the paper is the absent presence of race, to borrow a term from the Dutch anthropologist Amadei Macharek. What I do follow in the paper, and it overlaps with the question of the absent presence of race, is how the plane mediates this controversy. And I think that the plane became a kind of complex mediator in several ways over the fate of the people threatened with expulsion. So in social media networks, the plane served as a way to symbolize deportation. And it was used on all sides of the struggles, sort of both pro-deportation and anti-deportation. So the plane was very visible here, and it is in all sorts of other situations, as a kind of political metonym, the part that stands in for the whole. But the plane also figured as a site of material politics. So, for example, there was this letter written by 82 prominent black British public figures urging airlines not to accept the Home Office's contract to conduct the deportation. So they were trying to name and shame the airlines and to sort of, mobilize public unrest and antipathy around the airlines as a way to sort of actually politically intervene in the struggle. And that's worked in some cases. For example, Virgin Airlines no longer conducts deportations from the UK, and at various times other airlines have pulled out of it. So I open with this vignette as a way of tabling this sort of wider question of aviation and deportation. My claim is that there's a gap between the way we follow and perhaps participate in a controversy like the Jamaica 50 as publics and activists, and the way that most scholars theorize and think about deportation. What is this gap? Well, I think that with the Jamaica 50, and as with many other mobilizations and anti-deportation protests, airlines and airports feature very prominently in the public imagination of deportation and in actions against opposing this particular enforcement practice. Whereas when we look at a great deal of the scholarship on deportation, aviation is really quite marginal. It only ever appears, usually quite incidentally. And as I've argued elsewhere, the forced removal of illegalized people and rejected asylum seekers from the countries of the global north is absolutely dependent on a whole infrastructure of planes, airports, air crews, flight routes, seat markets, travel agents, aviation norms and laws, and so on. So without this heterogeneous world of air power and the particular carceral geographies that it enacts, policies of so-called removal and return would be inconceivable in their present form. Yet scholars have rarely examined civil aviation as a technology of deportation. One exception is the work of Deborah Weissman at UNC and her colleagues, who've made a similar point about writing about ICE air in the United States. So I share their call to move the study of deportation beyond seeing it as a legal concept and think about it as a physical act, one in which systems of commercial aviation are pivotal. So the paper's partly a call to take air deportation more seriously. And let me give a little bit of context for that term. We have boat migration has become a sort of widely used, recognized concept, both in academic writing and in public discourse. And for good reason. Like, we come to recognize the way in which maritime laws, maritime spaces, boats have become absolutely sort of life and death questions and zones and struggles. So boat migration is recognizes that the sort of material geographies and infrastructures of seas and oceanic movements are an integral part of how migration is policed and contested in the present. But not so when we think about deportation. We have a sort of largely immaterial approach, almost as though, people are perhaps moved by like transporter beams. So, there's a lot of writing and obviously investigation into detention, but nothing like that around the actual aviation systems. So that's what this my 5-year project on air deportation has been trying to sort of address that imbalance somewhat. So one of the fruits of this work is a special issue that recently came out with the French-based journal Anti-Atlas. It's open source, so anyone can go to it. And we've brought together some very interesting works from a variety of scholars, activists, critical geographers, journalists, and so on. So I encourage people to look at that if they're interested in some of the findings of the project. So that's a little bit about the background to the project. I'm not going to talk about sort of air deportation in general because the sort of term can encompass many different aspects. I'm going to sort of zoom in on one particular aspect, which is the UK's charter flight program. And I'm going to offer a little bit of a statistical portrait before sort of zooming in on a few sort of concepts. So you can see from, and all of this data is, I've generated it from Freedom of Information requests that have mostly been made by investigative journalists and activists, but are kind of in the public domain. Because one of the things about the UK's charter flight program is it's really quite secretive. There's a real dearth of kind of publicly available information or data about it. So, I mean, for example, overall, we know, I've seen a figure that Germany, about 95% of its deportations in total are by air. There's no figure for the UK, but the Home Office says, we don't publish or collect data about mode of transport for reasons of cost. So we don't know the precise figures of deportations overall from the UK, but probably a bit like Germany, they're in around 90%. So the aviation is absolutely central. But if we're looking specifically at charter flights in relationship to all enforced deportations, we can see that they are a minor phenomenon, but they're sort of crucial in a lot of ways for the kind of long shadow that they cast across the deportation regime. You can see there that the numbers sort of drop in around 2019, and they've started to tick up again very recently. And when we sort of break it down, here's the sort of sense of how the distribution of number of flights here is shown in purple. You can see it was really high in the 2010, although nowhere near, compared to the sort of aviation system that the United States operates. Then it falls off, and then it really ramps up 2019, 2020. And this really coincides with a changing sort of geography of this charter flight program. So you can see here in its early years, and it kind of began in 2001, but the data set that I've been able to assemble really kind of starts in 2010. So you can see that early on this charter flight program was very much focused on countries like Afghanistan, which is marked there in black, Nigeria, which is the green and white stripes, and then Albania, and you can see Albania is the one country that sort of runs throughout this program. It's sort of one constant of the deportation charter program. What you can see by about 2019, 2020 is very much a change in the geography. There's a kind of Europeanization of the charter flight program in terms of the destinations. And this very much coincides with Brexit on the one hand. There's a sort of real push in 2020 to sort of expel people just before the Dublin Convention, which is the EU convention that allowed states to expel to third countries, to countries where it could be it was deemed that their asylum hearing ought to take place. So there's a real push then to sort of utilise the Dublin Convention before Britain leaves the EU at the end of the 2020. There's also a concerted programme related to the arrival of the boats coming across the Channel, which becomes this sort of huge public spectacle, the border spectacle, around this time as well. So you have politicians sort of saying, we're committed to sending back 1,000 people who've arrived on small boats. And so there's this sort of, you set up this kind of dynamic between the plane and the boat. This charter flight program doesn't correspond or map neatly onto the distribution of the nationalities and the citizenships who experience deportation the most from the UK. So what you can see in that sort of the light brown columns are people of Indian nationality. The yellow and red columns are people with Chinese nationality. They're by far the largest numbers proportionately and absolutely of people being expelled. But there are no charter flights to either India or China. So it really tells you something about the sort of geopolitics of this program. It's about the UK's power to build routes. And this speaks a little to what John was talking about earlier, about empire and learning and how methods of forced movement kind of travel within empire or in neo-imperial spaces. So if we go back to, we see maps all the time of migration routes. And I've called this a sort of ingression bias. We're always seeing, the lines and the movements and the arrows showing how people are purported to cross borders illegally. But if you type deportation routes into Google image, what you get are either maps or images from the Holocaust, or maybe you get historic maps of, say, Britain's deportation of Acadians from the Atlantic provinces, what's today Nova Scotia, to Louisiana. There's very little in the way of sort of images or visualization of deportation as a movement. So part of the project, in a way, is I'm looking at deportation routes. How do you construct deportation routes? And the UK sometimes in parliamentary hearings kind of boasts about, well, we've been very sort of successful at creating deportation routes to difficult countries. And there they sort of mean, say, Afghanistan or Iraq in the early 2010s. And they talk about how other European partners have been keen to sort of learn about how you build a deportation route. The paper kind of engages with some of the sort of science and technology studies literature and the carceral geographies literature to think about, develop some concepts of thinking about, power and struggle within this world. And I'm not sort of going to unpack that a lot, but what I want to do is sort of highlight three, I talk about both the affordances and the encumbrances of aviation. And one of the affordances is obviously speed and reach. And we haven't sort of really appreciated or grappled with, how aviation transforms deportation, how it really does internationalize and globalize it compared to, say, when you're tied to rails or when you're tied to ships. So it creates a sort of new geography of deportation, and aviation sort of empowers the state in various ways, but it comes at a cost. This ability to move people quickly over vast spaces, it comes at a cost. And in the case of the charter flights, it's literally, the cost of chartering a plane. So once you charter a whole plane, you have seats to fill. And you've sold this program to the public on the grounds that, well, it's cost effective, it's efficient, it's about saving you tax, saving your tax money. So you sell it as a program that's all about efficiency and volume and large numbers, sending them back kind of discourse. But then you have the problem of how do you fill the seats? Because, it happens that deportation is entangled in law. And people facing deportation have various rights of appeals. So frequently the media gets hold of stories about, well, there were only, 10 people on this flight that was supposed to take 100 people. And this becomes a scandal in its own right. So it puts the Home Office under a lot of pressure. So what we find is what I call in the paper workarounds or fixes. So this is really a way of also sort of thinking about mutation in deportation, how this deportation is not a sort of singular or homogeneous thing or practice, it's constantly changing. And by looking, by zooming in on these little details, we sort of see these changes that are perhaps otherwise missed. And that was one reason that my other data source is inspection reports. And I use them as a kind of what Foucault would call an archive, where you've got a series and you can sort of trace little changes. So some of the workarounds, one of them is special arrangements, which is where, if you're being deported on a regular plane, if you have a judicial review going on, then you have a deferral of your removal. Whereas if you're on a charter flight, the Home Office in its letter to you says, because of the cost of the charter flight and because of the complexity and the logistics, a judicial review will not be sufficient to defer your removal. You can only defer your deportation if you get a court injunction, which is a much higher bar to sort of jump over. Another workaround is the reserves, which was a sort of status of person that was only discovered by the inspectors. This was initially being done covertly by the Home Office. It's like a standby. You're taken to the plane. You don't even realize that you're a standby deportee. You might fly. If the seat opens up, you might not. And the last one, which is the one that the Home Office doesn't admit to, but it's sort of documented in media reports and Freedom of Information requests, is a roundup, where you're literally going out to arrest people because you have a plane chartered and lined up to a particular country. So it completely turns the sort of legal concept of deportation on its head. It's meant to be a case-by-case thing. It's not about nationalities. But here we see the sort of logistics of the regime changing the sort of legal and philosophical ideas of deportation. So in other words, and this would be my conclusion, there's a sort of materiality to this sort of aviation aspect. It's not merely something that puts a legal and political phenomenon into effect. It has a sort of irreducibility in its own right that reshapes what deportation is, what it means, how it appears. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Walters. And our third and final presenter for this panel is Dr. Patrisia Macías-Rojas. Dr. Macías-Rojas is an associate professor in sociology and Latin American and Latino studies at UIC. Her main research interests are the areas of race, migration, and borders, and the global politics of punishment. She is the author of From Deportation to Prison, The Politics of Migration Enforcement in Post-Civil Rights America, which won the Oliver Cromwell Cox Book Award from the American Sociological Association. Please welcome her.
Hello, beautiful UIC colleagues, Andreas, Esther, Jennifer. I feel in good company. Lori, I think Schaffner is looking. Okay, yeah, that's often the case with me. Okay, so I'll get started. So basically, I have been studying U.S.-Mexico border enforcement and the connections between punishment and mobility for over 2 decades, mostly through a combination of ethnographic observation and history, that I'm intrigued by the interplay of both. And so that said, what I'm presenting today is actually a work in progress. It's for a new project that's in its early stages. I have returned to the field site after 20 years after the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. And so I am sort of prepared these remarks because they're helping me to think through the ideas that are shaping the project. So again, work in progress. Oh my goodness, I just saw my child. Okay. Okay, so here we go. Deep breaths. So the recent fatal fire in a detention facility in Ciudad Juarez points to a deep historical connection between punishment and mobility. Punishment and mobility have a shared lineage that was actually separated and obscured after the abolition of slavery. And so despite this historical connection, the way that we study mobility and punishment today is as separate concepts that derive from separate laws, think immigration, criminal law, that derive from separate institutions, think the immigration system, the criminal legal system, even though they share similar logics. So this is a really complex history, but what I want you to remember is that after the abolition of slavery, two distinct narratives of mobility emerge. And here I'm talking about the US, of course. I know we have a global focus here. So two distinct narratives of mobility emerge. One is the more familiar dominant narrative of mobility that's based on this idea that this is a nation of immigrants. It's based on an image of the migrant as a settler founder. It's based on the idea of free white labor. It's based on the idea of liberal egalitarian ideals of being able to move freely. And so if you look up mobility, this is the definition that you get. This ability to move from one position or situation or place to another. And it carries with it the assumption that it's usually a better one, that you're usually moving to a better place or a better situation. So that's one narrative. The other narrative of mobility is actually based on immobility. So it's based on, as you know, this history of unfree labor and enslavement. It's based on a history of race and caste. It's based on a history of criminal stigma, a type of stigma, I should add, that no other country in the world has, where if you commit a crime, you are a non-person. So it's based on the history, it's based on this criminal stigma that was used to keep people in place and to maintain a racial order after the abolition of slavery. So I'm not going into more detail here, only to stress that these two narratives share a history that has been obscured. So the concepts we use to talk about migration and borders, and even race and borders, are embedded in this racial history and the ways in which mobility and punishment were separated into these different trajectories. And as such, they're limited, really, in helping us to analyze the punitive turn in border controls. They limit our ability to truly analyze borders through a lens of race and punishment because we only draw on these traditional narratives of mobility, this nation of immigrants model, that conceals a deeper racial history and past. And so the concepts we use to talk about the punitive turn in border controls are based on these narratives of mobility that really derive from the experiences of free white settlers, right, of European settlers who settled in the 13 colonies. And so our core concepts in the scholarship on migration and borders are often rooted in ideas of independence, of access to land, of mobility, of social rights, of integration. Whereas in the scholarship on race and punishment, the core concepts often derive from this concealed history of unfree labor, of dependency, of mobility and stigma and political exclusion. And so when we think about core concepts in the study of borders and border controls, you could say in a way that they fall somewhere in between these two narratives. So this traditional narrative and this narrative of mobility, this narrative of immobility. But often the way scholars analyze border controls is through a model of mobility, again, that is rooted in, that was created for the experiences of white settlers. But in actuality, border controls, as we've seen, are more akin to punishment. They align more with this other history that we typically don't use to analyze them, and are actually, rooted and based and stem from these experiences of unfree labor and these early debates around free and unfree labor after the abolition of slavery. And so that history of slavery and the aftermath of slavery really shapes how we understand borders. The ways in which borders developed as a field of study, the way we talk about borders, the way we think about borders, the way we write about borders derives from this history that when transportation and punishment were entwined and then separate, which our colleague William Walters and my colleague Soledad touch upon. So in other words, they derive from this shared lineage when mobility and punishment were blurred and entangled and then separated under a new racial order. So borders are actually embedded and steeped in this racial history, but are often analyzed through core concepts that are pretty often devoid of any analysis of race. Borders are often analyzed through core concepts of territory, sovereignty, and citizenship that appear on the surface not to be about race at all. And so borders, again, are often analyzed more through this other nation of immigrants model. So in this new project, I've been returning and drawing on critical race theory as a framework to reimagine and rethink core concepts in borders through a lens of race and punishment. And I'm not going to get into that intellectual, it's a fascinating intellectual history and intellectual lineage, but the text that I'm clinging to right now is that of W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. And so CRT, and I should say that Du Bois is one of the intellectual antecedents of critical race theory. So CRT gives us an alternative reading of borders. It allows us to see how core concepts of territory, sovereignty, and citizenship are actually racially embedded. If we look at the border and border controls through a lens of race historically, and if we situate it in this history, then we can reimagine how we talk and think about borders. And so CRT, for me, it taps into this logic of the border that has been overlooked. This logic of borders functioning more like punishment. And so the traditional view is to look at borders through this traditional lens of mobility. I mean, think about it. Borders are often thought about, okay, they regulate unwanted migration or they regulate entry and exit. To me, that comes from a particular model of migration. And so the traditional view is to think about it as more akin to the management of mobility and migration, to the regulation of entry and exit. This is a story that's devoid of race, although there are really important scholars that have brought in race back in. But this conceals the way borders share a history with punishment, and particularly that history when punishment and mobility were entangled. And I'm referring here to a topic that's already been covered earlier on the forced mobility of paupers, of poor people and convicts, right, to populate this land, to cultivate it, to settle it at the expense of indigenous peoples. And so CRT brings that hidden history into focus. It brings into focus that racial history that's buried, that history when mobility and punishment were entwined but became severed and racially separated under a new racial order. It brings into focus core aspects of borders that have seldom received full attention, aspects of border controls specifically designed to contain and confine, right, that are more akin to immobility than to mobility. And so one sort of core aspect, or this one function of borders that has been given less attention and that's highlighted when we look through this lens, is the way borders actually function to disrupt settlement. And this is, I'm wrapping up here, and to keep people on the move, as a co-author has written. And so this is a different way of thinking about borders than simply talking about the regulation of exit and entry or restricting unwanted migrants. For much of the history of the US-Mexico border, border controls have functioned to disrupt settlement. And so the best example is the history of policing of Mexicans on the US-Mexico border, but the logic also applies to Chinese immigrants during the era of Chinese exclusion. There's a really interesting book, Racial Reconstruction, that looks at this. It's super interesting. Anyway, I would argue that it also even helps us to understand the logic of what we're seeing today, of the busloads of people being brought, to Martha's Vineyard, to Chicago. But the historical function, I guess to come back to the point here, the historical function of the US-Mexico border has been to facilitate, not to restrict, but to facilitate a temporary flow of labor without settlement or claims to land. And so again, notice this is different from the traditional model of European migrants who were allowed to settle, who were given access to land and social rights. That's not what the logic and the history of the US-Mexico border has been. So I'll say it again. The historical function of the US-Mexico border has been to facilitate temporary flow of labor without settlement or claims to land. And so border controls have explicitly functioned to disrupt settlement. And this function has been explicitly stated in early Border Patrol handbooks, and that just stuck with me, seeing that in the training of early Border Patrol handbooks just has sort of stuck with me because it connected with what I was seeing on the ground, where Mexicans and Latin American migrants are allowed to enter through a voluntary departure system, right? But without settlement, and then experiencing that constant disruption, that constant dislocation, that constant sort of fragmentation of networks. And so what I also observed is that in bringing in unwanted labor, border controls were also targeting people with longer history of settlement. And so this is what I've observed in my ethnographic work on border policing, but also we see it in the interior as well. So if we look at the case of Chicago, which I'll briefly mention, and we look at the history of Mexican migration to Chicago, and we had our colleague in history to thank, Latinos in Chicago, for this really important work. So if we look at the history of Latinos in Chicago, it's interesting because Mexicans here in Chicago don't experience the same kind of hyper-segregation that African Americans have experienced, right? It's in the literature. But what's interesting and what Lilia Fernandez's work shows is that Latinos, the way that we've experienced sort of segregation is through dislocation, is through disruption of settlement, is through gentrification. It's this constant sort of uprooting and just this inability to allow us to establish roots so that we're constantly thought of as foreigners when in fact we are not. And so, and here I'm really drawing on my colleague Ralph Cintron's idea that in a conversation we had once about this idea of trans displacement. And so I'm playing around with this idea that this is one of the logics of borders, this dislocation, this displacement, this fragmentation of networks that this other model allows us to think about. So let me just wrap up. So it's basically what I'm trying to say here is that old ways of thinking about and studying borders aren't that relevant anymore. They conceal more than they illuminate because the frameworks themselves are rooted in a particular racial order, right? Based on this system of managing mobility created for free white ethnic free labor and one created for formerly enslaved people. And so we need new frameworks to account for these shifts, right? And so critical race theory offers ways to rethink old concepts and to better understand the connections between race, borders, and punishment. And so although borders are studied and analyzed apart from punishment, they actually have more in common, right? With scholarship on punishment, they share a logic with race and punishment. Borders derive from this concealed history when transportation and mobility were connected, then racially divided and separated. And so all I'm trying to say is that we're stalled in our understanding, that these old frameworks and concepts that we use to study borders and punishment are actually racialized. They're embedded in this racial history in ways that we haven't come to terms with. And so we have to consider the sort of the racial history of these concepts, and only then, I think, can we really deepen our understanding of the punitive turn in migration controls. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful presentations. We have approximately 18 minutes for questions and answers. And so I'd like to turn it over to you, to your questions.
Hi there. I have a question for Soledad. I was wondering about the relationship between debt and this waiting period before migration. So many people who come to the U.S. now and presumably in the past are indebted not necessarily to the employer or even to the recruiter, right, but to the loan shark or even family members you borrow money for at sometimes incredible interest rates. So I wonder what the relationship is between that debt and how the problems of policing it when we have laws about debt peonage, but not about that.
We collect.
Why don't we collect 2 more questions and then turn it over to our panelists?
Thank you. Do you hear me? Yeah. I have a question for Soledad. I was wondering about the Darien region and the logics of governance there. That they have like an autonomous indigenous government. It's a especially protected zone for environmental for the environmental law in Panama. So I wonder if these 2 considerations also contribute to make this space a space of exception to some extent, and how this thing works for people who is in transit there. And I have a question for William. And I was thinking in your intervention and in how this use of like these charter flights is actually contributing to modeling a charter deportation model itself, in the sense that you were suggesting that it is difficult to trace these deportation routes, but it's also difficult to trace the impacts of this deportation process, in the sense that in some cases, like following how it happened in the States, sending people back to Central American countries, these people, some of them were killed. They were running away from violence. In some sense, they were returning to their home states, and they were killed in the process. Some children were misplaced in countries that they should have been. So I wonder if this is a debate in UK too.
Hi, thank you all. Patricia, I was wondering if you see in your analysis of mobility, immobility, some room for categories of both property and wealth accumulation, and the flows that are accepted in those processes. So for instance, after Guadalupe Hidalgo, you have a change in the border and a massive transfer of property from Mexican Americans to Anglo-Americans in California, in Arizona. So there is something in terms of how we conceive mobility that has to do with how we understand the wealth must flow, who gets to accumulate wealth, who doesn't, who is deprived of those opportunities. Thank you.
Hello? Yes. Thank you for your questions, and I will start with the question of the debt. That's a very important piece of all of this, and I think that within studies of border regime, we have not paid much attention of how the debt functions as a control mechanism too. Migrants, before leaving their home countries, they already get in debt with chulqueros, local prestamistas, but while they are on journey, they have to also get in debt to continue their route. And how do they manage that? Usually they connect with their families, and their families will get in debt too. So this means that there is an end-chain indebtedness along the route, which also alerts us on how the economic factor of all of this regime is playing a key role within the control of mobility and immobility across the borders. Also, I would say that debt also comes into play as part of the political economy of the migratory corridors, because not only chulqueros are lending money, but also cooperativas, local co-ops of part of the financial system. So in local villages, local towns in the Andes, for instance, they will lend money to people at high interests. And also you have chulqueros. So this means that, again, this entanglement between the illegal, legal, licit, and illicit economy is playing a key role within the dynamics of mobilities and immobilities. And I think that paying attention to the debt opens up a new picture of analysis. And in the work that I've been doing, women are also the ones that are getting more in debt, because they are the ones that stay at home or the ones that are starting to move across the same complex journey. So here you have a couple of new research of avenue to be analyzed. And regarding the Darien, Luis, the Darien is it's one of the most complex spaces nowadays across the Americas. One thing that we have to understand is that the Darien is now calling our attention, but people have been traversing across the Darien for decades and decades, and they have been negotiating with the indigenous groups that are living there. So what I have found of the research, of the preliminary research that I've been doing, is that the changes in the dynamics of controlling this land is the jungle, is the gap that connects South America with Central America, has been transformed because the paramilitaries now have been subsumed under the Clan del Golfo. This means that they have negotiated with indigenous territories there to be in charge of one of the zones of the jungle. And most of the narratives that I've been collecting from migrants that have been able to traverse the Darien is that once they negotiate and they pay the paracos, as they say, they can traverse the jungle following a couple of different paths that are, of course, not being controlled by any state authority. So your question about how the state is not present there, and how this idea that the Darien is like what you said? Yeah, a state of exception, it's totally true. And here we need to question what is the role that the Panamanian state is doing there, but also the Colombian state. I think that there is much to talk about it, and thank you for the question.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for your question. I would say that charter flight program has a kind of paradoxical visibility. So in certain operational ways, there's a lot of secrecy. So for example, if you're traveling on a regular flight, you're told the time and place that you're leaving. If you're on a charter flight, you're just told this sort of 2-week window, and a lot of people report, they're woken up in the middle of the night and taken out of the detention center, and they're in, a terrible state of anxiety and confusion. So there's that kind of secrecy. There's the fact that, this was initially part of the program is about, well, the problem when people are on regular planes, they can disrupt the flight and hopefully, a fellow passenger will intervene. Or the captain often will sort of say, no, this is actually not safe to carry this through. And they'll have the deportee and the escorts removed from the plane. And this was one of the whole reasons for the charter program, was to create this sort of avenue or this deportation corridor, to use Hasselberg and Dropbaum's term, a new kind of deportation corridor that takes it away from the regular flight system. So there's all kinds of operational secrecies and invisibilities. But then you have these controversies, say around the Jamaica flights. And the flights to Jamaica are quite infrequent. There's probably been about 5 or 6 in the last 10 years, whereas there's flights to Albania sometimes every month. But the Jamaican ones, because of the kind of raw nerves that they set off, say, around Windrush, become really sort of large-scale kind of public controversies and struggles. And so they become very visible. And, you have then the beginnings of tracings of who is on this plane. So, I mean, let's say the work of my colleague Luke de Nerona, who's written a wonderful book called Deporting Black Britons, which sort of spends a lot of time with people in Jamaica who've been removed on charter flights, often hearing, that basically I'm a national, I'm a citizen, that I was deported because, the Home Office screwed up the paperwork of my grandparents or something like that. Or the recent Esparto flights, which are these, rapid, sort of accelerated drives to remove people who've come on boats across the channel. And again, journalism then will follow sometimes the story, a guy from Sudan who's been sent back or sent to Frankfurt, for example, and then where do the Germans then send him? So there is the beginnings of a sort of opening up, and that kind of resonates with the kind of literature that turn towards a kind of post-deportation, like our colleague Shahram Khosravi, the book he edited on that. The other thing I would say about this heightened visibility, and it's something that I think in a way, it's ambiguous, it's equivocal, because it's not as though politicians are like, oh damn, there's a controversy about the Jamaica flight. It's coming back to the absent presence of race. There's something about the charter which is also, it's about the power to cluster. It's about a power to sort of herd people, to put them together on a boat, which evokes all sorts of, distant historical memories, say, of transportation. So even though the politicians, the government will say, this is a legal process, everybody on this plane, there's been a case-by-case basis, which sometimes is true and sometimes isn't true, nevertheless it generates this image of kind of clustering of, say, brown bodies on a plane, which makes headlines, and sort of, there's a lot of the public then, they dig that. So you can't sort of scandalize it by saying, look at this flight, it's terrible, because there's a lot of the public that says, yes, it's actually too good. They should be sent on boats, not planes, because planes are, too luxurious. And they hear the word charter flight, and they think, whoa, we go on charter flights to Spain. What's wrong with a charter flight? Yes.
So, Christian, I love your question because it raises, it sort of is a good example of the new kinds of questions we can ask when we shift this perspective. Mm-hmm. And so critical race theory actually does talk a lot about land and property because it's based on the ownership of, or the people as property under slavery. And so, so what I love about this example is that it actually, this transfer of property that you're asking me to consider, that it fits with this idea of disrupted settlement. And so I'm going to sit with that. But I'm also just in hearing, the responses and things like that. I mean, it is interesting, the question about debt, I think, is also important, because that's something that people in the criminal justice scholarship talk about. So it's in our interest to really, I guess this is what I'm getting at. It's like we study these things separately, and this is what I mean. It's like there is a racial separation in our concepts. Literally, I think I'm seeing my colleague in CLJ. We were at a conference recently, and the migration scholars were here, and the criminal justice scholars. And I don't know what you did, but I was going between two rooms, like, okay, where do I fit here? But yes, thank you, Christian. And it is sort of making me feel like, oh, maybe there is something to this. Like, keep going with this. So, thank you so much.
And we have time for one more question, maybe two.
So I have a question for Dr. Macias. I was wondering, I guess I'm a student of Ralph Cinturon, and a lot of what we talk about is sort of the world in relation to climate change. And one of the big concepts we talked about was the notion of climate change migration. And I'm wondering, in your research, and honestly, I'll open this to the panel too, and all of your research really, is there sort of, like, with climate migrants, the concept of deportation becomes kind of convoluted, because it's like you were deporting people to areas that are now uninhabitable. So I'm wondering, one, does the criminalization of climate migrants change? And two, what exactly, like, does migration look like in relation to climate change?
Whoa, that's awesome. Please, you take this one, and then I'll try to add something at the end.
Yeah, that's a very complicated question, because this is what we are witnessing now. All migrants that are traversing from the Andean region across Central America, they are already climate migrants or climate refugees. But the problem is, if before there was no, as we know, law that has been put in place to protect people on the move, with this idea of climate refugees, it's even worse. We know the limitations of the 1951 Vienna Conventions in refugee matters. We also know the huge limitations of the 1984 Declaración de Cartagena in refugees matters. So if we want to expand this idea of climate refugees, we are revolving with documents that are in reality death letters. So what do we do? That's a huge question. In Central America, we know that the dry corridor, which is the corridor that is pushing people to move out of their fields, to move out of El Campo because of what's going on there, those people are joining the migrant caravans and are joining all the masses of people arriving here. So as you mentioned, and I think that this is part of a symposium like this, the idea is to bring together the conversation on the problems that normally are treated separately. But now we need, in this age of extremes, we need to bring the conversation and to try to discuss what do we do with this. Thinking about climate change, and with this I end, means of transport, William, airplanes are part of
that's
all
what
of
I was
these.
thinking.
And what do we make out of this? The deportation flights are part of the climate change. The camiones, all of this is entangled in such a complex moment that, of course, your questions as students always are enlightening. Thank you for that.
Yeah, can I add to that? Who's moderator? Oh, can I add to that? Sorry, I thought I saw someone with the microphone. So I love this question, and so I'm going to try to end on a uplifting note, and that is because in this return to the border to do this research, I've decided to bring in, I'm doing the research in communities that hit up against the wall, right? And so and they're in communities where people are not necessarily even migrants. And so one of those communities is an indigenous community. And so through that, I've been reading sort of more of the literature on indigeneity and borders and indigenous studies. And my colleague, Jonathan Inda, recommended this really amazing book that I want to recommend to you and everybody here. It's called Unsettled Borders. And I didn't bring in this book, but this book is bringing another view of mobility that draws on indigenous epistemologies. And, you know, you were on this trip with me where we visited, you know, ancestral lands, you know, in Mexico. And when we think about that, what she calls this sacred science, it's an understanding of mobility and footsteps and connection to land. And so to me, the answer to the question that you're asking is in that literature. And in that, those otros saberes, as a colleague in Mexico has referred, or these other epistemologies. Yeah, there was one other. Oh, but this is what's possible when we move away from these traditional models of mobility. When we move and when we bring in race, that then we can, you know, sort of interrogate things. And by race, I don't just mean groups of people. I'm talking, you know, because race is of course made up. I'm talking about a history of the idea of race, and that means reckoning with the history of slavery. That means reckoning with the history of genocide. And so. Yeah, so thank you for that question. And I should say that is my child. I'm a very proud parent right now. I'm sorry, I had to say that. I'm a very proud parent.
That is our time. Thank you all very much for sticking around.
We will reconvene at 12:30.
I've been wanting to meet you for a very long time.
Oh.